and we are pleased to offer this webinar today and with our partners, the National Compadres Network, which is participating in the webinar today. What I would love to do is just tell you a little bit about our presenters and what they will be covering today, and then we will get started with the webinar. Our presenters today, we are pleased to have Heriberto Hescamilla Morales, who is joining us, also known as Beto. After a mid-course career change, Beto changed from electrical engineering and received his doctorate in clinical psychology from the California School of Professional Psychology, the San Diego campus, in 1993. He's delivered clinical services through several community-based organizations, health centers in San Diego, including Amnesia, which is a residential treatment center for schizophrenics, San Diego City College, Catholic Charities, in addition to others. In addition to clinical practice, Beto has also taught psychology and Chicano history classes at San Diego City College and United States University. He's implemented engagement and mobilization activities in over 30 communities throughout the United States. And in addition to community organizing, he's also participated in the evaluation of several community and school-based health, crime, and teen pregnancy prevention initiatives. Has a lifelong interest in non-Western spiritual and religious traditions, including yoga, meditation, prayer, and shamanism, and has had a recent interest in integrating traditional healing into mainstream psychological practice. He's currently teaching a psychology class at United States University, is a member of the Center for Integrative Psychology of the Alliant University, the National Compadres Network, and since 2010 is an independent consultant for OnTrack, providing technical assistance on cultural competency. So we're pleased to have him as one of our presenters. We also have as a second presenter, Tello, who is an internationally recognized expert in the areas of fatherhood, family, strengthening, community peace and mobilization, and culturally based violence prevention and intervention issues. Over the last 30 years, he has dedicated his efforts to preventing and healing the pain of relationship and community violence, teen pregnancy, fatherlessness, and internalized oppression by speaking to over 500,000 people and training thousands of facilitators across the nation to address these issues. He is one of the co-founders of the National Compadres Network, which was established in 1988, and the present director of the National Latino Fatherhood and Family Institute. He's presently working in numerous communities and integrating a trauma healing informed approach to violence prevention, and is a proud father of 3 children, Marcos, Renee, Emilio, and a grandfather of Amara. And we are pleased to have Jerry here as well. And our final presenter is Lucila Sanchez. She's an associate professor and chair of the Counseling Psychology Department at Santa Clara University. She received her master's degree and doctorate from UC Santa Barbara in counseling clinical school psychology with an emphasis in counseling psychology. She's developed and currently coordinates the Latino Counseling Emphasis, which is aimed at working with the Latino population, and she's published numerous articles in the area of Latino mental health, specifically examining variables that affect counselor credibility, the effects of bilingualism in the counseling process, stress associated with acculturation issues, and the mental health impact of immigration on Latinos. And she also has a small private practice. So we are excited and pleased today to have these presenters share with us and share with each of you the topic, which is La Cultura, Cura, so transformational health and healing. And today the webinar is going to focus on addressing the multi-dimensional issues that Chicano Latino families face in living in today's society. And I will actually invite them to share more specifically about what they are doing when we begin in just a moment. I want to acknowledge that this is part 1 of a webinar series that they will be participating in over the next few weeks, and I'll say more about that a little bit later, but we hope that you will join and participate. This is also part of a larger webinar series that CIMH is offering dedicated to looking at community-defined practices within ethnic and cultural communities. So with that, I'll turn it over to our presenters and thank them for the learning that I know is about to happen. So thank you.
Okay. Well,
and actually, I apologize. This is Christy. I wanted to make sure I said this one more time. I'm not sure I said this at the beginning. I apologize. If you do have any questions throughout the course of the presentation, please use the chat box to indicate those, and we'll try to respond to them. Everyone will be muted, but if you do want to raise your hand or pose a question, those are some ways that you can do that, and then we will ask the presenters to respond as they're able to, and have some time of Q&A at the end. Okay, thank you.
Well, good morning. This is Jerry Tello, and I'd like to thank you for inviting us to share this morning. This is, as was mentioned, a part of a three-part series that we will be embarking on, and this first one, as was mentioned, Chicano Latino identity, culture, and the basis for mental health. The next one, and one builds on the other, so it becomes some foundational information that then will be built on for the next session, which will focus on cargas and regalos, challenges, and culture-based strengths of raza, and then the third, remedios y curaciones, beyond treatment to culture-based healing. So this first one, and I'm having a little trouble moving these slides. I'm not sure if you can. The slide is not moving, so maybe you all have it over there. What we want to do in the beginning is, really just do acknowledgments that even though we're focusing on what is now we're terming Chicano Latino, we'll go into that in terms of identity and culture. We want to recognize, at the beginning, what we call in our Nahuatl language this concept of Intloque Nahuake, and Intloque Nahuake means interconnected sacredness, the interconnected sacredness of all people, of the universe, of everything. And so as we begin this series, we want to acknowledge that, acknowledge all people and of all races, of all ways, and so we begin by asking permission that way, and in our traditional way that we would do that. My grandma would do it a different way. My abuelita, my grandma was from Mexico, and little lady, she would come over and get up real early in the morning. She'd get up real early, sometimes 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, and before she did anything, we had a little altar, a little place where she had her candles and her saints and all the significant spiritual relics, and she would kneel down there, and she would ask permission for the day. She would ask for guidance. She would connect, and in her way, she taught us the significance of that, significance of connecting. Before you begin to do something, you have to connect. You have to be. You have to center yourself. You have to give thanks. You have to. So in this way, just to reflect on and to reinforce the significance of that practice or that tradition, we really want to ask permission in that way to all the ancestors and all the people that have come before, all those that have come before that left us these teachings, left us these traditions, left us these ways. And even acknowledge even the struggles, even the painful things that have come through, so that we can learn these lessons about life. And so we want to begin that way because that's a very important thing in all of our cultures, and the connectedness. And we'll talk more about that as we move. And this next slide refers to that interconnectedness. That la cultura cura, the concept of culture cures, really reflects on this, that within the collective dignity, love, trust, and respect of all people exists the wisdom and resources for a beautiful, harmonious tomorrow. And what that means is that within each cultural way, there are values, traditions, practices that can bring harmony, that can bring healing, that can bring balance. And therefore, that means within a family that exists too, and that means within an individual too, because the genetic memory and genetic interconnection that goes on when you see an individual. If you see me, then you're seeing my father, you're seeing my mother, you're seeing my grandparents, you're seeing my relatives all the way back. And that's a different way of looking at things, because in our society, looking at the individual, we think we're just dealing with one person. And in fact, when we look at this circle of life, we look at it in a very simplistic way. We look at it a unidimensional way, like, it's just flat like this. It's childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and elderhood. And what we recognize and what many traditional cultures recognize is that your development and your beginning and your inspiration and your lessons don't just start when you're born, that there are things that went on before you. There's a genetic memory that comes through. There's a whole number of other things that are laid before you, and so when this child is born, they really come with all of those things, and so that's why it's such a sacredness to see a child born, because you see the hope. You see the hope of generations, and so it becomes such a significant thing. When we were little, when a child would be born, we would, go visit the baby, and we'd all of us get in the car. And back then, you didn't have seatbelt laws, so you could put everybody in the car, right? You didn't have to choose who you took with you. We took all of us, sometimes 8 or 9 of us in the car, and we'd go visit the baby. And my grandma would as we were driving there, she would give us the instructions, and the same instructions, that when you see the baby, you got to touch the baby, and the touching was that connection, that you're connected. You're not just admiring the baby, okay, bonito, how beautiful. No, you got to touch the connection. But the other thing she would say is, when you see that baby, you say something beautiful, And I saw my grandmother do that many times, and some occasions, the baby wasn't very good looking, but she would say, what beautiful toes this baby has. She would find something beautiful, because she understood that the spirit and the energy that you put in that child really will affect them for generations. So, we look at this simplistically as this circle of life, but we really recognize that there's some ancestral teachings. There's some teachings that have gone back way, 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 way back, and in every culture it's this way too. Every culture has their own way they teach these teachings, and their own way that they give these teachings, and it may be a little bit different, but that first one, you're a wanted and you're a blessing, it is very significant. And as I mentioned, my grandma would get up and go to her altar, but after she finished praying, that she'd go and come to our room where we as kids slept, and she'd give us all a blessing. She'd bless us like that, And it didn't matter if we were, what we looked like, good-looking kids, not good, skinny, fat, whatever, good grades, but she blessed us all, And what I didn't understand is that was such a significant thing until I began, working with people and realizing that some people never get that. They never feel wanted. They never feel like they're a blessing. That second thing of sacred purpose, that you're here for a sacred purpose. You're not, and many people in our system, well, they're the presenting problem, or the delinquent, or they're the high risk kid. No. You have a sacred purpose. So when people come to you, it's not, they may have been sent to you for some other reason, but there's a sacred purpose under there. And the third is that there's teachings and values and teachers to guide you, and finally that you are protected. You have to have a safe place if you're going to heal, if you're going to grow, if you're going to develop. So today we're going to focus really on these first two, the whole sense of you're wanted, you're a blessing, and your sacred purpose, in talking about us as a people, talking about the whole sense of who we are, as a population. And
Hey, Jerry. This
yes.
is Christy. Can you speak up a little louder or into your phone, maybe a little closer?
Sure.
As we're having some
Is that clear now?
That's better. Thank you.
Oh, better. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. Now, did you guys read? I'm having trouble moving the slide, so. Okay, there we go. Okay. So that concept of you are wanted, you're a blessing, is really about connection and belonging, or the sense of identity. And that's a fundamental teaching of and that sense of identity of who are you? Who are we? And for us as a population, this is a very critical thing, but it also has, because of many things imposed by society, has become a burdensome thing, a very confusing thing, because there's all these labels of who we are, and one of the first questions often asked me when I present is, what do we call you guys? What do we call you? Are you Latino? You're Chicano? You're Hispanic? You're Mexican? Mexican American? What are you? Spanish? And the reality is that those are imposed things on us. We were never, in our traditional cultures, we're never known by labels. You're known by your family name. If you're a Ramos or you're a Tello or you're Hescamilla, and then you're known by your regional name. If you're from Michoacán, then people knew you were from that region. But it was never this label that was imposed that kind of tried to put us all together under one defined way in order to try and figure out who we are. So when we attempt to even name this webinar, right, we're going to talk about Chicano, Latino, because the thing is actually we're of many things. We come from many roots. And so when we begin to look at this, and many people will call us Spanish. We're Spanish because one of our languages is Spanish, right? But that would denote that we're just from Spain, or that is our heritage and our root. And some of us have some of that blood in us, but it doesn't define who we are. And so I want to begin just by talking about that. The concept of Mestizaje, the mixture of who we are. And most populations, a lot of populations all over the world have mixed blood, have mixed heritage, have mixed influence. And even if you don't have genetically mixed, once you grow up in an environment, once you live on this land that many of us are in California, if you will, if you're in California, you're living on an indigenous land here. You've eaten food from this land. You've breathed the air from this land, the water from this land. Well, all of that has now gotten in you, whether you're genetically connected that way or not. But when we talk about genetically Latinos, and we use the word Latinos for now, even though that's an imposed word, even though that's not the preferred word, we'll use that just for this presentation, because many of us have other ways that we prefer that really identify who we are. But generally, Latinos have an indigenous native root with European, African, Asian, and Middle Eastern mix. The current, if you look at the demographics, we see that whoa, somebody's moving these slides too quick. You see that 55.5 million, and it's larger now, Latino population in the U.S., 17% the total U.S. population, and the Mexican-based population make up 63%, Puerto Rican and Cubano, and then there's the mixture of other populations too. But it's important to recognize the mixture, and in California we have a very dominant Mexican population, or Mexican population root. In terms of language, it's important to recognize, and a lot of people don't know this, is that there's over 50 indigenous tribes in Mexico alone that speak their indigenous language today. Many are migrating to the U.S., so we're finding people in different regions of the United States, and especially in California, from Oaxaca, from different regions, that we give them a translator in Spanish. They don't speak Spanish. They speak their indigenous language. But in many homes, 34.8 million, or 69% of the Latino population, speak Spanish at home. And then in California, 26% of Latino homes are linguistically isolated. So we can talk about that a little bit more, and it will be gone over in some of the other webinars. But the important thing is language is one thing, but the other part is culture, is the whole sense of culture. Because even though you may speak English, your communication process and the words and the symbols that you use although they may be in English, the undertones of them still may have a cultural base. So it's much more than just having somebody that speaks language. It's maybe you speak spirit and speak the culture of the people. That's a really important thing. So as we move to the next slide, okay, here we go. We want to introduce and bring on and have him share some of the wisdom and knowledge. Dr. Heriberto Hescamilla, who, let me just say, first of all, is a compadre, a very good friend of mine, a good friend of him. He's the member of the Compadres Network, but just a really, really beautiful, beautiful man and teacher, and carries a lot of wisdom. And what he's going to share with us today is a little bit about this contrasting worldviews because we have an indigenous native point of view that then in this society is then in contrast to a European Western point of view that defines what is life, what is health, what is mental health, what is well-being. And it's important because we get inundated with this European Western point of view and kind of Western focus on what all of these mean without recognizing that many of our families bring a different point of view. So, Maestro, I want to pass it on to you and have you share some of the teachings.
Thank you, Jerry, and thank you for to the people at CIMH for putting this together. This is really challenging for me because I don't see anybody. I see the slide here in front of me. So I'm going to do my best to talk about what Jerry's been mentioned, the contrasting views, and I'll do so by sharing some of my experiences with Neiwa, with my brother here, Marcelino Robles, and that's his daughter, standing up to the side. I believe her Christian name is Silvia. I don't recall her indigenous name at this point. But in the process of talking about the experiences, I hope that I can elucidate, I can highlight some of those differences. And the reason that I believe they're important is, as Jerry was mentioning, these are beliefs, practices, and values that have endured. Sometimes they're not recognized in our daily behavior, but the foundation is there. And so hopefully one of the results of this little segment that, or actually for this webinar, is that you might be reminded of some of those. Ultimately, that's my purpose, is to help people remember and to remind people. So I met Marcelino about 8 years ago now. I met him through a friend, Alejandro Moreno, in Santana, in California. He called me up and said, "Hey, there's a Maracame that's coming through. Would you like to meet him?" And Maracame is what Marcelino, well, not what he calls himself, because if you ask him if he's a healer, if he's a Maracame, his response is going to be something like, "Well, the people say that I am." I've never heard him say that he is a Maracame. And part of that is because it's not a very prestigious occupation. Maracame, or as we might know in Spanish, curandero, in English, medicine man maybe, are people that are born to be that way in their tradition. Marcelino's told me about the dreams and experiences that he had early in his life that let his family know and his people know that this was his purpose. And then it was up to his parents to make sure that he followed the path that led him there, because one can have that purpose, but if it isn't reinforced and fostered, then it's not a good thing. People like that typically end up what we might call mentally ill. If you've ever read the Black Elk Speaks in the book by Neidhart, when he talks about Neidhart talks about Black Elk's early experiences, you'd swear that the man was a paranoid schizophrenic. I mean, that's what we labeled them and classified them. But anyway, Marcelino took on this path, and he's been doing it now for most of his adult life, and that's the healer that I said it wasn't prestigious because when people come to him, he can't turn them down. He could, but that would mean losing face, cara, with the community. He has the responsibility. Maracame, from what I understand, means someone that speaks with the fire or talks with the fire. So he has a deep responsibility to heal and to help his people. So when people go see him, whether it's 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning at whatever time, he doesn't turn them down. And the other part about that is that he doesn't get paid for doing this. Along with his responsibility of a healer, he has to continue working. He plants most of the people up in the from where he's from, the Huichol, as the Spanish call them. Huijarica is what they call themselves, are still farmers. They live off the land. They're indigenous. Some of them produce artwork that they sell to help themselves. So he has to do that in addition to his calling, which is to be a healer. So people will show their gratitude with an offering. And in these days, it's usually a can of Coke or a can of beer. Marcelino doesn't drink anymore. Or maybe some eggs that, or something, some kind of thing of value that the person offers in exchange for the healing. So that's Marcelino. And if we could move on, I'll just tell you a little bit about my experiences after meeting him about 8 years ago. After meeting him, I told Marcelino, when you're on your way back home, you have your house in San Diego. Ahí en San Diego tiene su casa, which is something that you hear a lot of Mexicans say. Mi casa es su casa, ahí tiene su casa. But, you know, a lot of us say it not really thinking or not really meaning it. Well, Marcelino called me about 2 weeks later on his way back, and he said, hey, we want to stay at your house for a few days. I hadn't told my wife about this, and so, which was a huge mistake. So on his way back, and so my wife, when I did tell her, my wife asks me, well, how long is he going to stay, and how many are coming? And my response was, well, I don't know how long they're staying. I just invited them. You know, you can't invite people to your house and ask them when they're leaving. That would be very rude. So he stayed, and the blessing of it is now that he comes every year, and he stays with us for about 2 months. And I've been down there about 4 times, and so I've had an invaluable opportunity to see his work. My part of it has been to observe and to translate, and it's in the translation that I've just been so enriched in really remembering what healing is and what culture and cultura is. Marcelino, for example, tells me that we have different ways of becoming ill. One of them is because we don't know what our ancestors did. We don't know what our grandparents did, what our great-grandparents did, how they lived, what they did, and as a result of that loss of memory, there's an incompleteness about us that sometimes, or we carry generational traumas that, you know, when you do an assessment and you ask people about their behavior, you seldom ask them, or it's not common practice to ask them, hey, what about your grandparents, where they come from? Because in this country, we somehow look at that as an invasion of privacy, that when to them, it's, and in traditional cultures, that's simply having an interest in the person. He knows that when he comes here. So the people here are very, very, you know, I walk down the street and they look at me, but nobody says hello. They don't even ask me where I'm from. And to him, that's a very, very strange behavior. But for them, it's something that's very important. The other reason that he says we get ill is because we no longer listen to the elements. The Huijarica see the world as a very animated place. Everything has life. Everything has life. Plants, dogs, cats. I've got my dogs here with me, so that's why I refer to them. But everything has life, and we are related to that life. And I'll give you just one example of what I mean by that. Last September, I went to the Fiesta del Tambor, which is their harvest ceremony. And during their harvest ceremony, they sacrifice animals, and the sacrifice is an offering of gratitude for the rain that they've received. And so in the sacrifice of the animals, what they do is they sacrifice young bulls, and they tie their feet, they tie their legs, and then they're in the ceremonial center, and then all or not all of them, but members of the community, especially the women and children, light candles, and they sing to the animal, and they pray, and they cry, and their prayers are thanking that animal for giving up its life so that they can have life. They recognize that without that relative, without that animal, they would not have life. And so they give their gratitude and cry. And then the animals, when I say sacrifice, what I mean is it's a sacred killing. It's done in a certain way. Some people get, all antsy because they start seeing that as some sort of witchcraft. But we kill our animals to eat them also. We just don't see how it's done. And we seldom thank the animal for giving us that life. We simply eat it and go about our business. So when you hear indigenous people like the Huichol, the Wixárika, refer to brother deer, older brother deer, they refer to it because they recognize that there's a relationship between them and that deer. They would not have life without that deer. That's the basis of relationship. So they say that we become ill because we stop listening to our relatives. We stop listening, for example, to Mother Earth. We stop listening to Brother Wind. We stop listening to Grandfather Fire. Those elements, and to the Wixárika, that's where life comes from. We have other relatives, human beings, that we relate to. They support us, but our life really comes from the elements, from the earth, from the wind, from the sun, from the water. That's the source. And if you think about it, if you hold your breath without air, you may live, if you're in really, really good shape, about 3 minutes. If you go without water, you may last a few days, depending on the weather and conditions. If we didn't have the sun, we absolutely would not last a single second. So it's a very, very deep appreciation for the source of life that they have not forgotten, and they tell us that because we forget that connection, that relationship, that we become ill, and so there's that deep reverence for the natural world. In their way of being, one of the things that I noticed in this ceremony and others that I've gone to is that it happens in a very, very matter-of-fact way. It's not a very, what we would call a solemn occasion. It just simply happens because in their way of looking at the world, there really is no distinction between the spiritual and the non-spiritual. There really isn't. And if you think about it carefully, these are concepts that we ourselves have developed as a way of understanding. We human beings are really marvelous creatures. Our brain works in a linear way, and therefore we believe that the world is linear. And so we create these concepts and then start believing that they're true. But in their way of living, there really is no distinction. What we call spiritual is probably, and this is my opinion, I have to tell you, the Marcelino doesn't sit down and instruct me. So what I say is my understanding of how they live. I just want to be very clear, because I don't want to pass on information that people are saying, oh, well, that's how, it's not that. This is my understanding. I observe, I talk to him, I don't study him. It's very offensive to study people in that way, and so I'm sharing some of what I see. But what we call spiritual is simply physical that we don't see yet or understand, and you can see that with animals. Animals have different range of sensing, their hearing, their visual senses. they see things that we don't see. We can pick some of those up with our instruments, but there's others that science, we still haven't found a way to see them. That doesn't mean that they don't exist. So we refer to the spiritual a lot of times as that which we can't see, and so we make that differentiation. But in their world, it's not differentiated that way. So there's very little differentiation between spiritual and daily life. There's a deep respect for ancestors and their wisdom, as Sherry was talking about earlier. And it's our opinion that these what you might call indigenous ways of being are underlying almost all cultures in the world. It's just its cultures have become more differentiated and articulated, and so some of these have lost. But these are very common. If you look across the world, very, very common that people respect their elders. It's the basis for mummification. There's just a lot of things that I could share that I'm not going to go into right now because I want to cover this. I really want to cover more than anything the last two, and I'm limited. I'm aware of the time. Social systems based on ceremony. Ceremony is a huge part of the Huichol life, the Huicharica life. They have 5 of them throughout the year, and all of them are related to the agricultural cycle. But a ceremony, just in a nutshell, if I can put it, is always a systematic way of reconnecting with those elements that we've lost track of, that we've forgotten about. And they're usually in a circle. The circle, you'll see on this slide, the man in this, at the forefront there, these are from pilgrims that are returning from their Holy Land. You'll see a mirror on his chest. And the mirror is a very, very, very significant part of Huicharica, Mesoamerican culture, and even European. I could go into more detail, but we don't have the time right now. But the mirror basically is so that one can see themselves. And a ceremony is a gathering place where you come to see yourself, to see your life. And then the last one that I think is significant is the idea of learning through personal responsibility. The Huicharica say that if they don't do their ceremonies, for example, that the world will end. We sometimes recognize that as, well, a lot of us, as superstition. But think about living in a way in which your behavior is connected to the world around you, all your relatives, all your animals. And you would act very, very differently if you felt that sense of connection and belonging to all of that which goes on around you. And I think that's one of the treasures of this early way of looking at the world, and something that we hope to incorporate into our trainings, workshops, and teachings. And I think I'll leave it at that because I've used up most of my time. If there's any questions, then I can entertain them at the end of the session. Thank you.
You know, one of the things, Dr. Hescamilla, that I was thinking about is, in terms of ritual and ceremony, you're referring to it in the traditional way that Marcelino and the Huicholes do it, but in our home, I remember the ceremony. I remember the ceremony, like that I mentioned, of the bendición, the blessings. But I also mentioned, I remember that when we were young, we'd go visit people, and my dad would scold us before we get to somebody's house, and what he would say in Spanish is, remember when you get to your relative's house, before you run and play, you hug and kiss everybody. And so we had to connect. We had to connect with all these relatives before we, did what we really wanted to do, was go play. And then, we'd see people and we'd leave and we'd say adios. And adios means, with God. We reconnect and we bless them and they bless us, and in that way too. So that some of these traditions and ways, even though they may not be done with ceremonial outfits, or they're integrated into our way of life. And I just wanted to mention, because there's a question over here about your reference to to mental health illness from Don Marcelino. Many times what I've seen too is when people begin talking about spirits, when people begin talking about their dreams and they dream about this, and my mom would wake up and say, "Pues tengo que llamar a tu tía. I have to call your aunt because I dreamt that she was sick," and she'd call her and she was sick. And my mom would make decisions based on what we call un presentimiento, a feeling that she had, and unless you understand those elements, we hear a dog howl at night, and there's what's going on. What is that dog howling for? Because the animals sometimes feel things before we do, and so all of those part of day-to-day life that helps us balance, understand, and figure out, what's going on with us that way. And so I appreciate what you share, and in every community, when I talk with people, they say, "Well, my grandmother was a curandera too," and so it's almost like everybody had a curandera, and that's the truth. That in our home, all of our relatives that are connected that way knew remedies, new ways of really healing, of helping, of finding balance. I don't know if you want to talk about these two slides here, and these two here, Beto, that relate to that.
Well, I think one of the questions asked about what we're talking about, I can't pronounce the word. Yeah, I think I understand the question though. There is a foundation that I think that a lot of us didn't pay attention to, but it's still there. And so you see, for example, one of the consequences of not understanding things in a more contextual way is that young men are misdiagnosed a lot of times. Aggression is more easily translated into delinquency in some cultures, and that's part of that misunderstanding of ways of looking at things, confusion, of not knowing. One of the things that Marcelino tells me over and over again is the first thing is, one, to protect myself, and the second one, that I really have to have a good understanding. Tengo que entender lo que estoy haciendo. And we do so much of that our behaviors, our reactions to a lack of understanding. So we see a misdiagnosis of conditions. I did a training once and I was explaining mal de ojo, and the psychiatrist at the back of the room said, "You know what? Seriously, I diagnosed a man as paranoid schizophrenic because he was telling me just what you're telling me now." And he had never heard of that.
And mal de ojo means evil eye. It means the sense that someone has put some type of energy on you or some type of intent on you that affects you.
That's correct. Yeah. And people have forgotten that when Freud began his practice, he was a student of Mesmer. Mesmer was studying that same process back then, but he had, for a lot of reasons, couldn't pick it up. But anyway, and then we see this documented in research. For example, this study by the U.S. Health and Human Services Department that just finds time and time again that not having the same language and culture, or when there's a disparity or a disconnect between healers and the people that they're healing, that a lack of understanding results in poor services and a lack of success. So yeah, just add a couple. Please just add a couple of sentences here. And thank you. Okay.
And so when we have contrasting worldviews like this, and it really, what begins to happen is we begin to understand that the other part of this is that historically, many of our ancestors and many of our relatives have gone through a trauma related to this, because there's a historical legacy of when newcomers came to Mexico. There was a whole different point of view, a whole different intent of why they came, and and their arrival to all of this. And so this other part of now understanding, a new way, if you will, became then imposed in a similar way that the names have been imposed and caused difficulty, because in terms of our identity, then we have this indigenous past, but we also know that Europeans came and mixed with the natives, and Africans came too, and Asians as well. But for many of us, in terms of identities, we have all of those, and sometimes we have, the indigenous blood, but we also have the integration of European as well, and symbolically, if you understand that one was the oppressed and one was the oppressor, we have both within us. And so, from a psychological point of view, the battle sometimes between who we are, recognizing again that a lot of our the matrilineal part of us really is very much indigenous based. So this generational trauma is something that often doesn't get understood really. And I'm trying to move this next slide if you all can help me over there. But okay, the generational trauma has resulted in families and culture with generational wounds and behavior. What's not recognized and really isn't brought up, even though we know this about other populations, we understand slavery in African American populations and the Holocaust, and we also, with our native population here, First Nations, we understand the tremendous destruction that has done and continues to be done. But historically, many people don't know that it was only over 20 million, and the figure goes from 20 to 50 million actually of our relatives were killed, raped, abused, and the residual effect of that. Because I think, well, if my great-great-grandfather experienced that, how did that trauma then affect his ability to be a grandfather or a father? How did that affect then the next generation? How did those wounds come down? The land was desecrated and defiled, and that's really significant when Dr. Hescamilla talks about the reverence for all these things, for land and for animals, and when you see those things desecrated and just killed and just used, and what does that do to you, because you're interconnected with that? But the things that really helped us to stay balanced and to stay focused and give us purpose, our ceremonies, traditions, values, then we're demonized. Then we're said you can't use those, you can't do those things, they're not good, they're of the devil, of the demon, whatever that was, and then indoctrinated in unknown, confusing teachings, and again, what does that do to you? What does that do to you when you? And here's a saying from one of the indigenous people of that time, and we have writings in our we have ancient writings that document this, and there's a codices, there's a whole number of what we call volumes, and they're called codices, and this is one of the indigenous people. It says, because neither do you understand us, nor do we understand you. We don't know what it is you want. You've deprived us of our good order and way of government, and one in which you have replaced it we do not understand. And now it's all confusion, and without order and harmony, the Indians of Mexico have given themselves to fighting because you brought it upon them. Those who are not in contact with you do not fight or in peace. And during our time of paganism, and it's in quotes there were fights or disputes that were very few. They were dealt with justly and settled quickly, because there used to be no difficulties in finding out which of the parties was right, nor were there any delays or cheating as there are now. And Dr. Hescamilla also talked about responsibility. So in that indigenous thought, there's a sense of responsibility, your sense of palabra, your sense of who you are. We then have this writing that talks about oppression, right? And the impact of oppression on someone's mental health, and it's significant to take into consideration when, and what is stated here, the systematic pervasive routine mistreatment, judgment, stereotyping, misrepresentation, criminalization, and we see that going on. Paulo Freire writes, the oppressor constantly tends to transform everything surrounding it into an object of domination. So we have to be objective, see people as numbers and really diagnose them in the categorical senses of things, and begin then to prescribe based on that. So this whole aspect is not that it's right or wrong. It's very different. It's very different from a point of view that looks at things that are. And when you objectify, then you have, Latinos overrepresented in criminal justice systems and misdiagnosed. Many Latinos have been misdiagnosed or not diagnosed with mental illness that are in the criminal justice system as well, and they have issues that really are about, so what happens when you're invalidated for who you are? Because to be honest with you, when we go have to fill out forms, we're not even a race. You have to check yourself under another box, and that distortion in you, that continued questioning of who are you whole, are you really valid? When you're made to feel ashamed of who you are, and discrimination, and even that internalized oppression based on, and this happens to other populations as well, that you begin to integrate then those feelings as well, where we see certain people as more attractive, the lighter skinned are more attractive, the darker skinned are not, and the discrimination of those people that look more indigenous or more African, then begins to filter in as well. And you're made to feel like your worldviews are very deficient, that if you think that way, that it's not going to get you ahead, it's not going to make you successful. And then targeted for not belonging, and goes on today. I mean, it's I've been stopped by immigration a number of times just to check my papers, I was born here. And then pressure to adopt, societal ways. So this all brings on the sense of fear, the sense of being scared, and it draws us to a sense of confusion. So who are we really? And when you ask young people, that who are you? I mean, many of them are very confused, and to the extent that not even sure about their own lineage, their own heritage, their own identity. Who do they belong? Who are connected to? And that confusion not only happens in the generic sense, but happens even among us as well. In all this work that we've done, one of the things that working with adolescents is that they get so upset when they're not understood. And they ask, "Do you feel me?" And when people don't feel and understand, when young people go in a store and they're followed, like security's following them, or people are afraid of them, or people target them, for nothing. It's a confusing thing when you haven't done anything wrong, and there's already this confusion. You're checked. You're not whole. And what happens in our society too, when we discuss issues, for the most part, a lot of times the major aspects of discussing things, it becomes a black-white paradigm. It becomes, and many times we don't even show up in statistics, and that's it's very confusing when we begin to try and understand who we are. The psychocultural confusion then manifests in several ways. Insecurity, often masked by boastfulness or inconsistent behavior, because you don't want to show you're insecure, so the bravado comes out, the false bravado. Vulnerability manifested by intrigue of those in power, and then we begin to say, well, those in power, they seem to be in control, so let me go with them. But the underlying thing is the cultural shame, the denying of your culture, your history, your family, and I remember as a young child, not wanting to speak Spanish and not wanting to sometimes let people know, who my relatives were, take them home, because I was, made to feel ashamed of, who my family was. And then inevitably that confusion then spills over into being angry. And now, we see a lot of angry little boys. We see boys at 4 and 3 that are angry. The anger permeates. And what we do in society, we put them all in anger management. We put all the angry people together, and we tend to isolate and separate, and that isolation and separation is exactly the opposite of what Dr. Hescamilla was talking about in terms of the really harmonious life of interconnectedness, of being together. And so when you feel confused anyway and disconnected and not accepted and don't feel like you belong, and then you are struggling and you're disconnected again, or then that anger sets in. And no one helps you with this anger. It turns to the general apathy. You get unmotivated. You forget it. We tell a kid, we're going to kick you out. Kick me out. I don't care. or it becomes this rigid fear, or a hypersensitivity where you then see this reactiveness or this moodiness that that sometimes appears as anxiety, you know. But if no one helps you with that, it turns to hate, and that hate becomes then a deep depression. That deep depression where you no longer care. You no longer care about what happens, and it doesn't matter. And we were doing some work in Merced, California, and we brought some parents together because some of the kids were having trouble in school, and there was a group of women, about 10 women that were there, and we began asking the women what are their concerns and what's going on, and the woman says, I'm sad, I can't sleep, and because I stay here in my house all day long. My husband goes to the fields to work, and my children are learning English, and they're ashamed of me. And I said, so what do you do? She says, well, I went to the doctor, and he gave me medication. And we asked all the women. There's like 10 women in the group. 9 of them are on antidepressants. But no one is helping them. I mean, they're isolated. These women are isolated. No place to share. No place to even understand the dilemma they're going through. The dilemma of them being isolated and their husband going out and he has people to talk to in the fields, but she has no one. And the kid now in this cultural transition, because he's learning English, and now he believes he's smarter than his mom. And so this women are very depressed, but no one has thought about to bring them together to begin to connect them in that way. And so this internalized depression or hate then turns into with the husbands, what ends up happening with men many times, it turns into being controlling and very jealous because of the insecurity. But the other thing it turns into is anger toward outward hostility and acting out, and we see this in a lot of adolescents. But then the self-medicating, the self-harm, the drugs, the alcohol, and the violence. But if no one helps you with the hate, it turns to self-hate, and that self-hate really becomes these dissociative patterns of behavior. Anger towards inward, the self-destructive behavior, the overwhelming anxiety and the self-sabotaging behavior, the established alternative rules and the fatalism, the lack of hope, and we see this in gangs. Latino gangs kill Latino gangs, and now we have norteños and sureños. We now break up in terms of colors, and so that we can at least have some semblance of control of who's our enemy and who is not, because when you don't feel safe anymore, and you feel targeted, and you feel confused, and you're angry, then how do you survive? You create these alternative rules, and you have no hope anymore, and you then have young people that their vision is going to jail, going to prison, and with families that have children that are struggling with this. How do you deal with that? And this self-hate then becomes, well, I guess it's us. We must be, as a people, we must be deficient. So this oppression has been so internalized so deeply that expectations of relational behaviors and treatment of women, children, and each other are based on false, imbalanced sense of continuing the cycle. So now it's been integrated so much. Cultural shame is so pervasive that there is a general mistrust, dislike, and avoidance of others that look like you. Gang violence, men fighting each other, and women being attracted to the most violent or aggressive men are all symptoms of people at this stage. So what ends up happening is that if no one heals this, so we provide treatment, we provide medication, but you haven't healed the internal wound. And if you don't heal that internal wound, it then turns to rage. And the rage can be turned outward, the rage can be turned inward. And that rage really is then you have no recollection of what Dr. Hescamilla is talking about, of your cultural authenticity. You believe that the negative adaptive behaviors are part of your cultural expectation. You believe that that's just the way we are, that Latino men are just borrachos, we're just drunks, and we just are, mujeriegos, we go with a lot of women, and we're not faithful, and we're violent. And it's true, those behaviors exist. But that's the wounded male. That's not the sacred male. And you believe that all women are subservient. Latino women are subservient, and I'm still looking for one because the women in my family were not. And the thing is that the reality is that when you found women that feel subservient, it's women that are wounded. We have a history of having very strong women that have guided movements and guided healing and have guided major transitional elements in our culture. So, but when you come to this stage, you begin believing that this is the norm now. And this occurs when many times the children are born to families that are functioning at stage 3, 4, and 5 that you saw earlier. No one has taught the children the true cultural expectations of being honorable men, or a person with palabra, a person with word. And so nowadays, before, the children, we had to be very respectful. We had to greet when we walked in. We feel children now that are very disrespectful to elders. And in fact, in the neighborhoods, in the barrios, in the gangs, you had to respect the OG, the veterano. And so if a youngster was getting out of control, you would go to the OG and you say, hey, straighten up this youngster. He'd go and scold him, and that youngster straighten up. Now, because we've lost the whole cultural integrity of the values, you go to a veterano today, an OG, and you say, straighten up the youngster. There's no respect. The youngster, F you, man, and shoot him in a second. Because we've lost the cultural integrity, and that's the checks and balance system. So what ends up happening in this process is that we end up seeing a system that incarcerates, it medicates, it indoctrinates, subjugates, isolates, and negates. And trying to control the behavior, trying to manage the symptoms without understanding that there's an internalized depression, internalized sense of not feeling balanced or not feeling connected. And the thing is that then we have people that come to us with certain symptoms and certain ways of being, and unless you have a certain sense of understanding the source of some of these issues go way back, and even generationally, but also connected to that concept of identity. Who am I? What am I? How do I find my well-being? And so we're very privileged to have Dr. Lucila Ramos Sanchez that not only teaches this to students, is a professor that teaches that next generation of helpers and healers, but she also is in practice working with familias. She works with families, and we're very privileged to have her to share with us maybe some examples of how this manifests in just day-to-day families, this issue of identity struggle and all of that. And thank you, Lucy, for being willing to spend your very busy time with us this morning and just to share some insights on it.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I know that I wanted to say for inviting me to be on this webinar. I feel very honored to be here. So, one of my main roles is a professor in a counseling psychology program, and I also see people outside, families and adolescents. And one of the things that is very apparent, I think, when someone comes in, whether it be a family or an individual, what I notice, because as we're talking about culture and identity, one of the things that is really apparent when someone comes into therapy, particularly Latinos, is that they come in with a lot of wounds. And they come in very wounded, meaning their sense of self, in some instances, who they are. Now, rarely do I ever get people coming in who on the forefront of what looks like issues of cultural identity or ethnic identity. Most oftentimes they're coming in with things such as depression, anxiety. If it's family, there's likely conflict and whatnot that has brought the family there. Oftentimes family bring in an adolescent who has been kind of either acting out, or there's been some behavioral issues or issues going on at school, or all of them. But rarely do people generally come in specifically with, oh, there's issues of identity. But what I find as you kind of dig deeper past the depression or anxiety or even the behavioral issues for many Latinos, some of the things I see are issues of cultural identity or issues of ethnic identity. Yet, you know, when you look at when you talk to other clinicians, or even the way sometimes I see clinicians being trained, being that I'm on that side of on that side as well, is that oftentimes people are taught to deal with those types of issues without really looking further behind it, maybe what some of the core issues might be. Because I oftentimes think that issues of ethnic identity or cultural identity are really, it's a core issue. You know, there's this movement in training, in psychology in general, I think, either for better or worse, but this trend toward this medical model, this biological basis of behavior, where people are given medication or that symptoms or disorders such as depression and anxiety and whatnot are all biologically based without really looking at the larger social contextual factors that might be coming into play that might actually lead to the symptomology. So in many instances what I see if someone isn't attuned to that culture is actually an issue, or that not the culture is an issue, but that lack of cultural identity might be an issue. Oftentimes it's the symptoms that are addressed, the clinical disorders that are addressed without really looking beyond that. And you can see it in some of the practices that are really put at the forefront of psychology currently, like cognitive behavioral therapy, which is, you know, the most researched psychological approach that we have right now in psychotherapy. And it too does not really go beyond core issues. It looks at behaviors, it looks at thoughts, it looks at feelings and how they, you know, thoughts, how they affect behavior. But it oftentimes doesn't go beyond that. And, you know, it is considered one of the more evidence-based, you know, the most popular evidence-based approach that we have. And yet it doesn't oftentimes get to that core issue that might be necessary when working with some Latino clients. And that's not to say that CBT is not something that it would be useful. I have used it myself. It can be useful, but part of it is also understanding that it has to be used as part of this larger contextual piece that we need to kind of move to or understand. So, you know, on the one side, there's this, you know, evidence-based theory. On the other side, we have other theory that talks about, you know, some people have heard of the cultural paradox, where those individuals who are most closely aligned with their culture of origin tend to have better mental health outcomes than those who are further away than those who are not in line or don't adhere to their, you know, culture of origin. So I think it's important to understand that there's research on both, on many areas with regard to culture. There's, you know, a couple terms, cultural identity, ethnic identity that I'll use, but they mean very different things. You know, the ethnic identity is more than just how one labels themselves, and it's very much in line with what Jerry Tello spoke of before with regard to internalized oppression. In fact, ethnic identity is a sense of the degree at which someone has internalized oppression. So all those negative stereotypes or discrimination that one views that influences their view of their group, their view of other Latinos, the degree that that is internalized will influence their level of ethnic identity, whether they want to identify with that Latino or not, Latino culture or not. Whereas cultural identity is more the sense of how interconnected they are with their culture of origin. Having said that, there are, you know, many youth, especially those who are born and raised here, or at least raised here, that have a lot of experience with negative messages that are given that actually can very much affect their ethnic identity. And I speak about them in tandem because I think that they're so intricately related. I think it's hard not to, I think that a strong ethnic identity will then by extension lead to strong cultural identity. I think it's hard to feel like you don't want to be if someone has negative views of the Latino population, they're not going to necessarily want to be infused or adhere to the Latino culture. So I think a strong ethnic identity is very important. Unfortunately, sometimes what you see in our society, and I can talk about this from different perspectives because I've seen it happen on different levels, whether it be adolescents or adults. But you know, what I see sometimes happening with adolescents is this, that these messages become internalized, and oftentimes, and with adolescents, how that is viewed is when they become adolescents, most of the time in our society, we just view the rebellion against parents as adolescent angst, and that's how it's kind of conceptualized. But with Latino youth, it's something more than that. It's oftentimes, it could be adolescent angst, but adolescent angst is very much a westernized view. It's not something that's necessarily prevalent in other countries or even Latin American countries. So adolescent angst is very much a westernized view. Having said that, when you have the implications for rebelling against and moving away from one's parents is very different for, say, a European American adolescent than a Latino adolescent. So with a European American adolescent, what you see is rebel against the parents toward society that is, whose culture is kind of geared toward their parents already. When a Latino youth moves away from their parents, rebels against their parents, moves away from the culture, what you see is them going toward a society that is not in line with their cultural origin and oftentimes contradictory to their culture of origin. And so they move away from this, their culture of origin, maybe in part because of that adolescent angst, or the other part is because of the internalized messages. The internalized messages that being Latino, maybe for them they've heard such awful, bad messages about it, they want to remove themselves. They don't want to identify it, unfortunately. And part of that is that they come to dislike a part of themselves that they cannot change. And that has implications for their sense of self, who they are, their well-being psychologically. So in some Latino youth, what you see is them moving away from the culture, not wanting to be like the parents, toward another culture that, or another, the society that doesn't necessarily embrace them back. And so they're stuck between two worlds of not really wanting to belong to their parents' culture, but not necessarily belonging to the culture that's the dominant culture here. And so what you see in other instances as well is them maybe wanting to move away from the language. You see that in some adolescents, especially where the parents are predominantly Spanish-speaking. Sometimes what you see is the children stop speaking Spanish or choose not to speak Spanish. And it becomes an unfortunate circumstance because language is one of the main ways in which they communicate. And so that level of communication for some is cut off. There was a case I had a while back of a 16-year-old girl whose parents had immigrated from Mexico, and she was, her parents brought her in not for family therapy. They brought her in just her because there were issues with acting out. She was engaging in certain behaviors. She was getting in trouble at school. She was being very disrespectful. So there were a lot of things that they brought her in for, and she was causing a lot of conflict, or she was seen as causing a lot of conflict within the family. One of the things that I saw, I thought was important, was to actually bring them in as a family. So I did work with her individually, but I thought it was also important to bring the family in because there was this sense of first helping her identify where all these behaviors were coming from her, that they were just not adolescent angst, but there was something further back, kind of having to identify within her what was going on internally. And one of the things we found out is that she was getting teased a lot at school, that she was not, the things that she would hear in and around school, whether it be from other students or even teachers, were not necessarily positive about who she was in terms of being a Latina, being someone from Mexican heritage. She felt like people didn't have really high expectations of her, and she thought it was because she was Mexican. And so she tried to the best of her ability to kind of distance herself from that. But it also caused problems at home. because she started to become very disrespectful toward her parents. She started to join other friends who were engaging in behaviors that would be considered high risk. And within the family, because when the family immigrated, they didn't know a lot of people, and they hadn't really developed a support system. I mean, they were very busy working and whatnot, but they didn't know a lot of people. They didn't have relatives around, and so they felt very isolated as a family. So they didn't have a lot of support outside, and so they didn't have a community like you would have maybe in Mexico, where the uncle could step in, or there was always somebody around that could kind of check the child's behavior. Here it was very different for them because it was just them. The parents worked. She came home from school, and sometimes there was people there, and parents were there, and sometimes they weren't. And so one of the things I thought it was important to do just individually with her is help her identify some of those like negative messages that she'd been receiving about herself, and identify them as messages, but not that they were necessarily had to define who she was. And then talk about how sometimes that happened, and that it wasn't, and to help bolster her sense of self. I think what was also important to do with the family, and so I brought the family in, the rest of the family, or the parents in, and had them work on trying to rebuild the level of connectedness that had been lost. So one of the things in therapy that we did was to make sure that therapy was done in the language that everybody could understand, because one of the things that was very prominent was that there was this isolation of language that was occurring. And so while the mom could understand English and Spanish, the dad could primarily only understand Spanish. So he was feeling left out of the family, often, especially when the daughter just spoke English. And so she could understand Spanish, although the daughter struggled with speaking Spanish. But we conducted in the language that everybody could understand, so that everybody felt included. What I also thought was important, because they didn't have a huge community support, was that I encouraged the family to kind of either resume some of the things that they had let go in their previous country of origin in Mexico, or to kind of reestablish new types of rituals that could help them develop support within the community. And whether that be resuming going back, to church that they had left, or joining some other types of organizations that would help them connect with other families. At the time, I also thought it was important for the young Latina. I looked in agencies, and I think this is also important when working with Latino youth in general, was to become very familiar with the resources in the area. I had at the time looked for a support group for her where she could be with other Latinas who might be experiencing the same thing. There wasn't anything at that time that I was seeing her that was open to her. And so what we did was the next best thing of like, okay, why don't you join a social organization at your high school where there are other Latinos where you could actually gather support. So there was that sense of connectedness in the community, but also connectedness within the family. Because I think that connectedness, kind of reconnecting with her family, was incredibly important. I think is important in general, because it's actually through the family that they can bolster that cultural identity, or that cultural connectedness. Because without that, oftentimes, adolescents will feel adrift. And so I think the family is very important in that. I know that we are coming close. I'm not sure if I have time for another case study.
Well, I think we are. We got about 10 minutes to go, but I did want to comment on the case, because what you did reinforce there was the significance of the two things that we talked about in terms of being wanted. That first lesson of being a blessing and being wanted, that is a core teaching, and then the second one of having a sacred purpose. And one of the comments that was made in one of the questions here that came through is often in our society, Western society, we begin to individuate children very early on and begin to separate them. So they're a separate entity from their family. Many times schools don't even know the family, don't care about the family. They're worried about this child is very bright. Let me help the child succeed. And actually systematically pulls the kids away. And even in therapy, when they're referred, they do individual therapy, not even bringing in the family at all. So ability for you to include the family and begin to help them, if you will, reground or root some traditions, some ceremonies, some whatever the ritual is, and even to help balance out, because one of the other questions that came up here is the whole aspect of how internalized depression now has seeped into families. So you have fathers that are very abrasive or abusive, and mothers that also disconnect from their children because they have internalized a sense of anxiety, and so some of these false teachings now we believe are part of the culture,
Yes.
but they're not. They're wounds that have now seeped into the culture.
Absolutely. And actually, that was another, and I'll just briefly say that was another one of my case studies that I had of a man who actually immigrated at a much older age. So he actually came with a pretty firm sense of who he was culturally. But it was his experience and his job that kind of constant messages of constantly being discriminated against because of being Latino, constantly being treated as less than on a daily basis, so that he was just a functioning man who was a family man, and fast forward 7 years later, he had developed some level of depression, but was most apparent in why he was referred to counseling was because that he was full of so much anger, and anger because of all this discrimination he had kind of internalized, and he couldn't do anything. He didn't feel like he could do anything about it, and I think that's one of the things that is most that's hard, is oftentimes they don't feel like they can do anything about it. He didn't feel like he could say anything to a supervisor or to other people. But it came out, and unfortunately it was placed upon his family. And so it is that sense of...
I think what happens in a system, too, is if that person gets referred to probation, they send them to anger management.
Right.
So they want to help them manage the anger without understanding that at least beneath that anger, there's some, there's a sense of confusion, and there's a sense of loss. We many times don't even recognize the sense of loss when you're disconnected from your cultural root. There's a grief that goes on. When familias move here from another country or feel dislocated, there's a grief that goes on that they never really resolve. And unless we give them an opportunity to explore that, I think, that grief turns into anger, into hate, into all those other things,
Yeah. So it was definitely, when I worked with that gentleman, there was one of the things that was most prominent, or that was most apparent when he was in therapy, was that nobody had ever given it a name. Like it is if as it exists, it's like smog. You breathe it in, but you don't always see it. And when we were able to talk about it, and I was able to help him identify exactly what it was and give it a name, he was able to actually deal with it. And then we worked on how is it that we can manage the anger around that, but also how to protect himself from, and part of that was going back, instead of displacing on the family, reconnect with your family, because they're going to be your biggest point of support, and find other ways to release some of that anger that you may not feel like you can actually share with your boss. But it was that sense of not actually being able to name it, and I feel that sometimes that is one of the biggest things with some clients, or even adolescents, is that it's so apparent that it has become such a part of their everyday life. They take it as just part of life, and that it's not something that it shouldn't exist.
Yeah, well, we definitely don't want to. We're hesitant to call it racism or discrimination, when we're dealing with therapy, and sometimes it just is that.
Right.
I reflect on my own family, in which my brother, years later, he's a grown man, he's 60-some years of age, and my mom was sick, and he began talking about his memory of when he used to go translate for her when she was young, and he began to cry. He said, they say ugly things about my mom, and my mom would say, what is they? Nothing, Mom, just pay the bill, that's all. No, but está diciendo algo. They say, no, Mom. And my brother wouldn't translate those things, and he ate those things. And after a while, when you hear ugly things about your parents so much, you begin to believe them. And so it affected his relationship with my mother and my father. It affected his relationship with himself. And my brother ended up, in the streets, ended up getting locked up, and no one, I'm sure, during that whole process connected it to, what messages he heard, about the people that he loved the most. And that anger starts someplace, but then it gets triggered someplace else, and then it gets manifested into drug abuse and gang, and it just, it continues to cycle. And so I want to thank you for the insights, because I think it brings them down to, the clinical sense and how it gets seen in the setting. And I know there's so much more that we could talk about. We're limited on time, so we're going to go ahead and we've got about 5 minutes more for the formal presentation, about half an hour more to present. So thank you.
Right. Thanks, Jerry.
Okay. So let's see. I'm trying to move this slide along. So what happens here then is we begin to understand that the true La Cultura transformative healing is not asking what's wrong with the person. The question becomes what happened to you to disconnect you from your sacredness. And so, we know that in our tradition, we have this concept of Huehuetlatolia, teaching of the ancestors. These are ancient writings that we have. And these writings talk about educación, or the character development. Niños bien educados are kids that grow up with a sense of good character, that have two concepts, itzli and nawat, and yorloro means face and heart. And out of that comes 4 values of dignity, respect, love, and trust. And so we have these teachings in our own culture. We don't need to go someplace else. We don't need to look somewhere else. We have these teachings that are at the basis, and sometimes, as Dr. Hescamilla says, we just need to remind families. We need to bring it up to their recollection, because they've been so busy surviving and just surviving in a day-to-day that they don't remember these teachings or these ways, that they feel ashamed because now they've been here for 3 generations and don't feel that that's what's important for their success, and schools and society don't reinforce these things, so they don't sometimes understand them or even see them. We're going to move next. This concept of then understanding that we have in our base ancestral prayers. Dia de los Muertos just passed, and now it's become this community celebration, but it's really about honoring the ancestral ways and the teachings and all those things. And there's other ancestral prayers that go on. The elders' wisdom for counsel and support, they're very significant to that we have elders in our communities that are curanderos, they are healers, they are salvadores, they know these teachings, ancient traditions, the blessings, are very significant. Sana, sana, colita, rana. People laugh about that, but in that, sana, sana, heal the last part, si no, sararás mañana. If you don't heal today, you'll heal tomorrow. Hope. The rooted family values, respecting elders, family, spirituality, and we're afraid to talk about spirituality when we're working with people, but it's the core. It may be cognitive behavioral for Western society, but it's emotional spiritual for rooted indigenous people. That's the base. Healing medicine, the curanderos, the salvadores, the healers, if you will, the spiritual massage people, the herbs, the tonics, the remedies, we have all those things. And sometimes then we modernize them and use Vicks, But Vicks became kind of the conduit for mothers then rubbing and gently loving their children too, and reconnecting again. And that smell of the eucalyptus that became symbolic and genetically then reminds you of a smell that goes way back. And the ceremonies of the mezcal, the sweat lodge, the danza, the arte, the music, the poetry, the chanting, the prayer. My grandmother used to meditate. She didn't call it meditation, she called it prayer. We have traditional ways that are healing ways, that are a part of who we are, that are part of our basis, and we need to understand that we don't need to go outside, that within our cultural realm we have all these traditional ways. So we can move on here. So trying to move the slide. Okay, so community healing, and I'm going to kind of flip through this because we don't have time to get through all the community healing, but to know that there's 5 elements of community healing that are really important, and we use the tree as the symbolic nature of the first is purpose based on individual, family, community dignity, rerouting people. They must understand within their ancestral wisdom of all people the teachings are there, the medicine is there. the teachings are there. Responsibility based on respect for a family community vision. If an individual only has a vision that doesn't reflect their potential, their true self, and only has a view of their negative self or their deficits, they will never be able to respond or have the ability to respond in a good way and have that sense of respect. Interdependence, and that's different from individuality, the sense of trust, building trust, interconnected trust. And we must work with people individually but connected too, to their families and their communities, because the reality is that we're all interconnected, to build that trust again. Internally, that intuitive spiritual strength, the development, circular learning based on love, not based on fear. We're a fear-based society. We tend to motivate people based on fear. The traditional indigenous way is based on love. You do it out of love for your family, you do it out of love for the next 7 generations. You want to do better so that the next 7 generations can do better, so that the children, your grandchildren, do better. And enthusiasmo, living life with a sense of purpose, sense of spirit, with ganas, with a sense of going ahead and doing it, and instilling or reinstilling the sense of hope. And that becomes very, very key. So the many things that we incorporate have to really incorporate Western medicine. And that becomes really the wisdom. How do you do that, right? In the next 2 webinars, we're going to really be addressing some of those things. The next webinar is really going to focus on the sense of cargas and regalos, the struggle between our gifts and our blessings with that internalized depression, with the baggage, with the trauma, or what we call susto. You know, when we were little, somebody would have a major frightening experience. My grandma would call it susto, or the spirit becomes frozen. And so how do we unfreeze? Because some of our families are frozen in the trauma, frozen in the wound, and therefore pass those wounds on. How do we unfreeze them? How do we help them to unfreeze and to reignite or transform themselves into their true sacred self again? And in the last webinar that we're doing in December, we'll focus on these integrative practices. Some examples of practices that are going on today, communities that are using that balance between traditional and Western, and really relying on the indigenous sense of true culture as we move forward. I know the time is up. It's 11:30. We want to try and stay according to time. We may have some time for a few questions if we want to go to questions. But you can reach us if you have any questions. You can go to our website, you know, at the bottom of the page, for National Compadres Network. You know, we're doing a lot of work here locally and nationally, and we'll explain that as we go on. But you can go on our website and see all of that as well. But really want to just give acknowledgement and blessings to all the people that are doing this work. There's a lot of people that are really trying to reroute this work in a good way. And as my mom said when we grew up, estamos aquí para servir la gente. We're here to serve people. And really that's what it's about. I want to thank Dr. Hescamilla and Dr. Sanchez as well for their insights, and obviously apologize for the short period of time, because obviously each of them could have taken this webinar by themselves and shared tremendous amount of wisdom and insight. You can, you know, connect with them too. They have their own websites and all of that. You can connect with them if you want further information. So I'm going to turn it back over to you all.
Okay. Thank you so much. So this is Christy Hagens with CIMH again, and I want to thank all of our presenters for a wonderful webinar this morning. I also wanted to note that although the invitation indicated that the webinar ran until noon, it's actually officially supposed to end at 11:30. So I do want to honor our presenters' time, but as you just said, Jerry, offer the opportunity if you or others are able to stay on a little bit longer to respond to some of the questions posed by the participants.
Sure.
We've been feeding them to the presenters throughout the past hour and a half that we've spent together. And there are a number of really good questions, some of which they tried to weave in responses during their conversations. But maybe we can take a few moments just to do that if you're willing to do that. The other thing I wanted to say before I turn it back to you to just respond to questions is that for those of you who are still on the call, I wanted to thank you for staying throughout. We will be sending an evaluation instead of through the GoToWebinar system. You'll receive it through SurveyMonkey in terms of asking you to respond to any evaluative feedback that you have. We also can make the recording available for today, as well as the PowerPoint, and we can email those to those of you who are on the call in terms of a link to be able to access the webinar as well as the PowerPoint. And as has already been indicated and you see on the screen, there will be a couple of additional webinars that the National Compadres Network will be offering in conjunction with us with CIMH. And as I said at the very beginning of the webinar, we will have additional webinar presentations and series from the other ethnic and cultural communities. So the African American community, the Native American, as well as the Asian Pacific Islander over the next few months. And so we will be sending out emails and notifications related to that, and hope that you'll be able to join us. So I'm going to turn it back over to our presenters. I think you see the list of questions that have been asked, and you all can respond as you are able.
Okay. Well, thank you again, and you know, again, I refer those of you to our website at the nationalcompadresnetwork.org. You know, we are doing a lot of work locally and nationally around many of these issues, and we do capacity building. We do trainings and institutes on these issues, and how actually to help organizations become more culturally rounded, and to begin to build this. And some of the presenters that we'll have in the next couple of webinars are actually part of the trainers and some of the leaders in this. So there are a couple of questions that came through just in terms of identity again, and you know, one of them had to do with you know, balancing out and understanding that even people that come from Mexico and people that come from, you know, other traditional countries sometimes come with false sense of who they are, because in their traditional countries there's also oppression. And there's been, you know, and if we look at historically what's gone on, it's not only by the dominant society. Sometimes it's been, you know, through religion as well. And so when we work with populations, part of that question of you know, ¿quién eres? Who are you, and where did you come from? Becomes that exploration of all of these things, well, the baggage that they bring, even some of the false teachings. I remember working with a family one time. Husband and a wife, and there's some domestic violence that had gone on, and the man, you know, they went on to explain and what happened. And the first time that he hit her, because it happened several times, is that he had come home from work during lunch, and usually she packs a lunch for him, and he goes back because he works at night, and she was on the phone with her mother, and she hadn't packed lunch, and he got upset and he hit her, and you know, she began to cry. He walked out, and he asked her mom, and her mom says, "Así es, mija, that's the way it is. You know, at least he has a job and all of that." And she says, he told her that, well, you just need to go and pray. Go to the church and pray. And she went to church and prayed, and in fact, she talked to the priest. And the priest told her, pues, es tu cruz, it's your cross. You know, God will reward you, right? And sometimes those messages come through even from people that we think we trust and we think we know. And obviously, you know, her mom already had some of the integrated oppression and integrated thoughts that women should accept violence, and that's just part of the culture, and that's just the way it should be. And even the priest had now used that in a religious sense, and you know, in a way that was very harmful. And so sometimes our role is really weeding through those things to return back to that the authentic culture, the authentic way of being. And part of that, part of the role in healing is cleansing yourselves from those things that have been passed on through the culture that are not good, that are harmful, that that really disconnects, as Dr. Sanchez meant, the sense of connection, that disconnect you from your sacredness, but disconnect you from your relationships. And with children, with adolescents, they're changing too. So we have to be able to like the Olin in our culture, that Olin movement symbol, that we have to be able to move as well. And it comes back to that primary element that you are sacred and you're a blessing. And I know in many presentations we're doing, and I'm seeing a question related to this. It's, well, okay, is everybody a blessing? Yes. We often, when we're working with adolescents, the LGBTQ population comes up, well, why aren't you, are you addressing the yes? The whole essence of that first teaching of you're sacred, you're a blessing, just the way you are, is so essential. And so we as a population struggle with that not only individually as we grow up in our own identity, but then when society says that you're not wanted, that you're the problem, that because of immigration, it begins to build layers and layers and layers of that disconnection and not being wanted and not being whole and feeling that you have to learn a new language or learn a new way in order to feel whole. And I think part of the healing is really recapturing that sense of you being a blessing, you being sacred, and sometimes that takes work in families as well to be able to do that, and within communities, because one of the aspects of internalized oppression within communities is that sense of now us judging each other. So we judge each other, the sense of celos or jealousy or envy, or sense of competitiveness among ourselves, then becomes an element that now destroys us as a people, without even recognizing also in the multicultural sense that we have many roots within us. So that the next seminar that we talk about, we'll talk about the many roots we have, because many of us have African blood in us, and some of us have Asian, and we have European, and we have all of those things. So we have to make peace with all of that and accept all of those as blessings as well.
I'd like to actually make a comment about the LGBT, from the Youth Alliance regarding LGBT and how the sense of belonging and the how everyone is a blessing. I think that there's these different historical views, even of someone who from the LGBT community, that has differed over time. And my understanding is that very early indigenous, even native cultures have a place for someone who is not necessarily attracted to the opposite sex, and that it's only really the more current notion of religion that has become so decisive, just so exclusionary of that group, as if there's only one way and one pattern of love from male to female. But that historically, even in indigenous practices, that wasn't necessarily true. So I think I add that because because oftentimes it's important to look at the context, that this exclusion of LGBT individuals is very much more recent within this last century of religion.
And I think again in the indigenous culture, that there was cada persona tenía su lugar. Everybody had their place and everybody had their view, and it's almost like, again, what Dr. Hescamilla talked about, that we recognize that everyone has a spirit. So all the animals, the deers are different than the turtles, that are different than the lions, that are different than everyone brings a blessing. And so in the traditional indigenous thought, and we have to again recapture that, because through the internalized oppression and some of the religious points of view, in many of our families there is this oppression, there is this discrimination that goes on, there is this pain that goes on to many of our children for being many different ways, and so part of our role is helping families to root themselves in this unconditional acceptance and unconditional love. But it's hard to do that when you're struggling with a society that doesn't accept you, and so that becomes the battle as well. That becomes difficult. But definitely that, in terms of cultural integrity, that is really the goal and the purpose of that. Okay. There's something related to nervios here. Well, again, we, in working with families, los nervios, for everything, becomes then kind of the catch-all, los nervios, that I'm nervous. And really what that really has to do with that whole sense of anxiety, of not feeling settled, not feeling balanced, not feeling whole. And know, we see it with children sometimes, right? The children that can't sit still, and we're getting more and more diagnoses of, you know, kids that are ADHD and all of that, and, you know, and the reality is that sometimes their spirit isn't settled. And what I remember dealing with a preschool little boy that was very angry and couldn't sit still, and I walked in the classroom and they had him in the corner, a permanent timeout, you know, like that was going to help him, you know, but they said it's for safety purposes. And this society uses that word safety purposes to isolate many of our people, incarcerate many of our people, and lock up and medicate. But what I realized in this boy, because is that when I went next to him, is this tremendous amount of anxiety in his energetic level, and he wasn't settled. And when I got finished working with this little boy, an elderly woman who was a volunteer called me over, and she says to me, "Ve ese niño, you see that boy?" I said, "Yeah." She says, "He's real angry." I said, "I know he's angry." And she says, "No, you don't understand. That's not his anger. That's his daddy's anger. That's his grandfather's anger. That's his that's his great-great-grand. He's got 4 or 5 generations of anger on his back. That's why he can't sit still." And for us, people that understand these ways, we understand that. We understand that sometimes you carry shame that is generations old, anxiety that's generations old, pain that's generations old. But the way, when we work with these young boys that have a lot of anger and their wounds are speaking for them, their wounds are hurting, you know, their friends, their wounds are hurting other people, their wounds are hurting their moms, we say to them, "Do you realize that you can stop 5 generations of wounds? You yourself, you have the potential to do that." And deep down inside of them, when you get below their fear and their anger and their shame, that's what they really want. And that's what mamas want, that's what daddies want, and that's what families want. But the ability to see beyond the exterior wounds or that internalized depression to get to the true spirit of somebody is really the practice of being a community healer. You know, and it doesn't mean healer in the sense of, you know, all the rituals and stuff, but recognizing that our job really is to help heal generations. What we recognize from the Compadres Network, because this is what happened to us 25 years ago, when we were thinking of going out and creating programs for the community, is before we could heal anybody else, we had to heal ourselves. And so we, you know, I've been in Círculo and working this way and recognize that if you want to do this work, you've got to do your own work. If you want to really be understand these teachings, then you got to work them for yourself, for your own family. Mother Teresa said, "You want peace in the world, go home and create peace at home." You know, and so, and my mom would say, "Pues dime con quién andas y de quién eres." Yeah? Tell me who you hang out with, and I'll tell you who you are. And if you really want to be about peace and healing, then you incorporate those people around you, you know, as much as you can, so that you can learn, so it can be reinforced that way. You know. Dr. Hescamilla, you want to share anything? Any final thoughts or?
Well, I was just looking at the last 2 questions. I'm not sure how to answer them, but I can offer, I guess, some thoughts, some ideas. One of them is about machismo and shame in our community, in Latino communities. You know, it's you know, that exists everywhere. Again, I think to repeat something that you already said, Jerry, and Marcelino tells me often, is first and foremost, protect yourself. And I think another thing about machismo that's not recognized, which is a huge, I believe it, and we talked about it earlier, and also about Mal de Ojo, is that in groups of people that have a more collectivist orientation, and this is, again, this is part of you know, deep-seated culture. Envidia or envy is a huge sin. It's a shame. It's a problem. And you see it a lot, and the culture itself discourages. The cultures are set up to discourage that, so that if one has a little bit more and flaunts it, or it, you know, makes a big deal out of it, that attracts envy, and envy leads to the destruction of that connection of the group. So I think, you know, getting that out in the open is very important. As Jerry was saying, like groups, círculos, community forums, or events that bring people out, so that these things can be brought out. Because what happens is, and a woman in Modesto, I think it was Modesto, Merced really explained this really well. And this gets to the gang issue problem that somebody else mentioned. She was talking about, this is a woman that had lost her son to a gang conflict. And she was talking about how the problem didn't end with him. You know, her son was dead now. But now she was sad, and that sadness affected the way that she treated the other kids. And there was a little brother there, I think he was about 6 or 7 years old, that was just clinging on to her side. You could just see it there in the room, the pain that he was experiencing. And so that little boy was in a way infected. So these kinds of events become community infections, and that's something that I think, from our point of view, has been a very individualistic orientation. We don't see that. We don't see a community illness, a community infection, and part of it, which I'll try to answer a question that came up earlier as to how we change this. Part of it is to see these infections as real and concrete, not. You know, one of the biggest fallacies of the medical model that Lucy was mentioning earlier is that there's an assumption that because we can measure something physically, that it has to be, the intervention has to be a physical intervention as well. That's a fallacy. We're measuring it physically because that's what we're looking at. You can measure it in terms of behavior. You can measure that behavior in terms of relationships. There's lots of different ways of measuring behavior, but measuring in one way doesn't mean that that's what caused it. It's just you're taking a different perspective. It gets kind of complicated. I don't want to confuse people.
Well, you know, and I want to add to your comment about what in our culture we call susto that exists in many communities, because there's a generalized fear. A frozenness in communities because of violence that is now integrated in many different neighborhoods, and the interconnection, because what's happened when you send all these kids to anger management, you send all the wounded people to prison, all of them are locked up. Well,
that's right.
There's still
it breeds more illness. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and there's still the need to belong. There's still the need to connect. And so you send them together, and now they're going to connect, and you reinforce the connection, and then you identify them, and then this society reinforces that connection of wounds. And we've created mafias.
Yes. It's not an individual doing that. The way that we intervene, and the prison system segregates people and reinforces that hurt. Yeah.
Well, and as a real practical example, in one of the cities outside of Merced, the city El Nido, they were talking to a mom there, and her kid was just having trouble in school. He didn't like school. His thing wasn't school, and so he'd show up late and he'd get bad grades, and he was getting kicked out of school because he just wasn't interested in school. He was, not applying himself, and so he had to go to a continuation school in Merced. And the mom's dilemma was there's two continuation schools in Merced. One, and this is the school district has done this, has separated norteños in one school and sureños in another school. And the mom's saying he's got to choose, but he's not a gang member. What am I going to do? And that's the dilemma. Now, even systemically, we got continuation schools that are separated into these two cliques, these two cliques. Because as a society, we don't know how to deal with this. And it reinforces some of this internalized depression. Now a mom that has a kid that's not good in school, now is going to get indoctrinated one way or the other. And I think, that's kind of indicative of how how our systems have been set up. And we know now that there are ways to deal with these things. We're seeing very successful interventions and successful programs that are going on all across the country. In Oakland, Dr. Ricardo Carrillo, Concha Salcedo are doing some wonderful things out there. In San Antonio, Isaac Cadenas and some of the people at AIT are doing wonderful. I mean, different places across the country, that in Salinas we're doing some major work there. In Merced, the mental health system there has invested in community-based intervention there, and so there are innovative processes that are now beginning to integrate some of these ways, and we can explore those a little bit more as the presentations go on in the next couple of weeks. So if you have additional questions, you can refer them, sign on to our website, and if you have questions also, I'm sure you can contact Sam H, and they can give us a list of questions that maybe we could include in the subsequent webinars that are coming up. We thank everyone, for joining us today, and thank you all that are doing this work. We really appreciate you all that are doing this work and are interested in doing this work in a good way. We really appreciate. Let me, as I end, apologize if we offended anyone, in anything that we said. We didn't mean to target anybody, or this wasn't about blame or saying anybody. It's really just about transformational healing, all of us healing and growing together. And we say that in a good way, and thank all the teachers and our ancestors for guiding us today. Thank you very much, and have a blessed day.
And thank you. Thank you, everyone. As indicated earlier in the webinar, we will be sending via email a evaluation, and really invite and ask that you respond to that. That would be very helpful for us. We'll also include the PowerPoint. It may take us a while to get the webinar loaded onto our website and have the kind of technical things done to it, to cut it and to crop it to make it kind of the best possible. So we will send that link to you at a later time. So we thank you for your time. Look forward to you participating with us on future webinars over the next few weeks and throughout this year. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The organizer has ended the session, and this call will be disconnected.